alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Daanish TV's English language TV channel, the global voice of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality here in Pakistan. And today it's great, gives me great pleasure to actually have someone that we were supposed to have a long time ago. I was really anticipating, but it's. It's wonderful to actually finally get her here because her work has truly. I know that many of my students who are watching, they know all about it, and we've read a lot of material on the subjects that she covers, and her work stands out. And so our guest is Professor Nazia H Kazi, and she's a professor of anthropology, and her just a phenomenal book, Islamophobia, Race, and Global Politics, is I can't recommend enough. And I, as many people know, I mean, this is the area of studies that I actually also myself work in. But I do, and there's a lot of people that are very close friends of mine that have written works on this as well. But even though I've not met Nazia, I consider her a dear colleague. But her work stands out, and my students will attest to that, to the fact that the reading her work really gets them to kind of understand and grasp what the role and the kind of the Islamophobia is kind of structural anti-racism. And how that functions in the world today, and most kind of clearly, sharply, trenchant analysis, very lucid, and so I just wanted to say that it's again a great honor to have you, Nazia, finally here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Nazia, so we'll get right into it because the topic itself, has been something that has kind of mystified as almost for the past, at least throughout the period of the war on terror, and its specific kind of function within that, the whole imperial enterprise. But I want to begin with some of the basics here, because the term now has, you will probably concede, come into vogue of the term Islamophobia, and despite, I think, that a recognition that yes, I mean there's some utility to using that word when it has a specific kind of a political usage to it that could advance some political aims and so on. But in some ways, if we could start with kind of your own take, because many people are writing about it, trying to define it, trying to explain it, your own take of kind of what Islamophobia means in the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with the term Islamophobia is we're using the wrong term. And at this point, we're sort of stuck with it. And I'll tell you what I mean, right? So obviously, I use the term Islamophobia. In fact, the original title of my book was going to be Troubling Islamophobia, because I really wanted to unsettle the problems with this term. And namely, what gets to count as Islamophobia means so many different things that sometimes it stops having any analytic usefulness. So for instance, and I speak from the US context, which is where I do my work, Islamophobia can mean the intolerance toward women who wear a hijab, certainly.
Right.
And Islamophobia can also mean the wave of deportations that took place of, working class Muslim immigrants after September 11th. And when you call both of those things Islamophobia, you're really losing the opportunity to talk about some really important things. For instance, the history of anti-immigrant violence in the US, particularly as it is doled out to working class migrants in the US who occupy a particular section of the US economy. So I think the problem with the term Islamophobia is, one, it really robs us of a chance to be more nuanced in terms of what is happening globally around the politics of class and empire. And secondly, there's that first part of the term Islamophobia, Islam, which kind of assumes that Islamophobia is sort of religious bigotry directed toward Muslims. And again, from the US context, we can see that that's couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, the first hate crime murder following September 11th was of a Sikh man, not a Muslim. And we also know that after September 11th, when George Bush created the Department of Homeland Security, right, which then came to manage immigration issues in the US, it was Latin American migrants who bore the brunt of that violence. So what would have been Islamophobia, in other words, counterterrorism measures meant to surveil and target Muslims, actually ended up impacting Latin American migrants. Or for instance, in 2016, when Native Americans gathered at Standing Rock to protect their treaty-protected land that was being violated to build an oil and gas pipeline there at Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the forces that were used to target those Native American protesters were counterterrorism forces. They used counterterrorism against indigenous people. So the reaches of what we would call Islamophobia stretch beyond the Muslim community. I also think it's important to note how Islamophobia is not evenly experienced among Muslim Americans, right? So in the US, and what I try to show in a lot of my work is that the most vocal, sort of the people who got to craft the language on Islamophobia were sometimes the most elite of Muslim Americans. So their experience of Islamophobia didn't often capture the concerns of folks who experienced the most violent and repressive elements of the Islamophobic regime. So in these ways, I sort of think it's important to, as I said, we're stuck with the term Islamophobia. We use it now, but to be very careful about the various things that get to count as Islamophobia and those that don't get to count as Islamophobia. And so sometimes, we want to be really careful with the terms we use. And I think that is nowhere more the case with how, sometimes sloppily, sometimes very generously, the term Islamophobia is deployed.
No.
I think I lost you. I'm not sure if you're speaking right now. There you are.
Sorry, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I got everything you said. One of the things, Nazia, that I really liked, I think towards the end, is how that the term does camouflage, particularly what you were speaking about, the differences, the different experiences of the people, adherents of Islam, Muslims, the way they have experienced Islamophobia, whatever, and we can get to kind of a definition, but the type of vilification, the attacks, and the nature, the degree of what they've experienced, this is not to say that we are okay with some forms of attacks or the other, but what we have to understand, the dynamics of, say, class in particular, that have in the United States has been incredibly important when it comes to many of these Muslim immigrant communities, South Asian, Pakistanis who have gone. So I think that's an incredibly important point, that at some level, Islamophobia does tend to erase those differences and experiences of these different sections of the population, and unfortunately, the people that get to speak about it most are probably the ones that experience the least amount of actually direct harm from the whole process of Islamophobia. But so now I want to get into kind of the question of, the mainstream narrative about this discourse is okay, and of course this has been there since 9/11. One of the reasons why kind of I got sick and tired of it, and I left it in 2008. But the whole idea that one can overcome this kind of passing phenomena of Islamophobia, which is kind of a rational reaction to what happened on 9/11 and so on, is to more understanding of Islam and education about a different faith religion that we know nothing about. Maybe buy a couple of copies of the Quran and so on and so forth. And if we just have enough of these interfaith dialogues over tea and so on, that will solve the problem. Uh, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is sort of this attitudinal view that exists about racism. So, and I often ask my students, define racism for me. And they'll say it's misunderstanding people who are different from you or prejudice. They won't say it's the likelihood that your drinking water in your city was poisoned, which has happened in the US in predominantly Black cities. They won't say it's the likelihood of dying from COVID-19. Now, I'm sure you're aware that the US has been the hardest hit by this pandemic, but it is Black and brown communities, the working class communities that have been hit especially hard because of issues of healthcare access. And so, these are not things that come up when people typically define racism. In other words, instead of defining race materially in terms of wealth and access to resources, people want to define it as an issue of understanding bigotry and tolerance. So if you read, for instance, Mahmoud Mamdani writing about, good Muslim, bad Muslim, he talks about culture talk. In other words, people often think that if we just understand one another's cultures better, or in this case, religious practices better, we can begin to heal and solve the world's problems. And that ignores the fact that, at its core, Islamophobia and all forms of racism are material. They are economic. They are embedded in our economic and political systems. And until we can begin to talk about them in those terms, we'll be stuck in the same problems. So the US White House might have a, Ramadan iftar. They may have, a Muslim liaison for, communications, etc. They may do all of these things and still carry out unprecedented violence in the so-called Muslim world. So what do those things mean then? I mean, and this is where I think we really need to begin to move away from the exorbitant amount of resources that are spent on this sort of culture talk initiatives. Interfaith dialogue, hijab days, community iftars where you bring together religious leaders from different communities, because these are not solutions to the problems of Islamophobia, which are at their core related to the economic system of capitalism, the US system of empire building. And these are conversations that typically don't make it in mainstream conversations about Islamophobia. And they need to be. They need to be at the center of those conversations.
That's exactly what I wanted to pick up on, because of course, and you're absolutely right. I mean, whether it was under Bush or Obama, I don't know if Trump got. I got anyone, but these particularly the most criminal things. I mean, these White House participation in White House iftars while the United States is bombing, several different Muslim countries, waging war on communities, not just Muslims, but all oppressed peoples within the United States and externally, so on. And then you think that these problems will be solved by just
I mean, this really surfaced in 2014 when Obama had his White House iftar, and there was an effort to boycott it by Muslim leaders and Arab leaders in the US, because this was the same time that Operation Protective Edge, Israel was just bombing Gaza in an unprecedented and sort of unilateral way that led to the deaths of so many civilians, especially children. I mean, it was really a gruesome moment. And for Obama to support that, he supported, Democrat leaders.
I believe to also invite the Israeli ambassador to that iftar.
Exactly. And so, this push to boycott was unsuccessful. There were people who were willing to go, who were eager to talk about, dialogue is the only way we solve these problems. I mean, so these rifts that exist in Muslim American organizing spaces are crucial because, they really reveal the fault lines of how people are approaching this problem of Islamophobia.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I mean, I just really wanted to hit that home because it's also a form of politics in which we have heard, both pre 9/11 and then, of course, after post 9/11, it doesn't go away. And again, you're absolutely right. It comes from a certain segment of that American, so-called self-proclaimed, often American Muslim leadership, which has tended to be male historically, and hopefully that changes. But the whole notion of kind of how do we, and to put it very crudely, to say, how do we become as powerful as the Jews or as the Israeli lobby? And how do you work within the system to kind of get in bed with and get the crumbs at the seat of the table of basically Pharaoh, and that's going to get us in the good books. How do we actually become part of the imperial system rather than how do we dismantle it? I mean, I think that's basically been the question, and of course we have had many. I mean, that's how I put it very very bluntly and
Yeah, and of
candidly.
course we have to be clear that in the U.S., Jewish Americans are divided on these
Yeah,
issues of U.S. empire.
which is again but the Muslim, the elite Muslim thinking is that, well, there's this just this very powerful lobby, and that they control, and that's why they have this enormous influence, and that's why the U.S. has this policy towards Israel. It's very simplistic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I take these divisions very seriously. I mean, I think that, we can think, for instance, of, what Hamid Dabashi has written about, brown skin, white masks, and sort of Western Muslim sort of informants. I mean, this became very clear with the unveiling of these CVE programs, the Countering Violent Extremism programs under Obama, which were seen as an alternative to the Bush era warmongering. But what they really were a form of thought control, soft policing, racial profiling that became Obama's sort of signature Islamophobic move, alongside his, expansion of U.S. drone warfare. But they kind of conscripted Muslim Americans to work with the state, to work with intelligence agencies, as if those agencies are not, the embodiment of white supremacist sort of imperialist violence to begin with.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I just have to mention and point out, because these CVE programs, countering violent extremism programs, counter radicalization programs, in the UK they have the Prevent, but these have been exported now throughout the Muslim world itself. And so, what is it's so saddening and tragic and disturbing is that you go from one country to the next, and which I do with here, Malaysia. So you have these programs going on, adopting the same language, narrative, etc., about this, about how these Muslims suddenly wake up one day and become kind of radicalized and crazy and so on, without looking at all the structural features of the world system, power relations, the American foreign policy, wars, occupations, and so on. But that's a very sad part. You raised it, and I will tell you that we have this here, and we have this everywhere in the Muslim world as well. You have regimes that have, I mean, we're speaking about, and there's obviously huge problem there about what's going on with the Uyghurs in China. But the fact remains that in terms of re-education camps, uh, which is also quite absurd, because those regimes, many of these regimes were responsible for quote unquote radicalizing them in that kind of theological direction in the first place. We're talking about the Saudis, the Emiratis, these and then bring them back and torture them and re-educate them. So they have their own re-education camps as well. So this is something that we have to take stock of when we kind of just focus on, okay, whether it's like a Western country or it's a Chinese or Muslim regimes. Many of these Muslim regimes have their own re-education camps, and they have gone
Right.
on to this.
And I think there's a really perverse use of the Islamophobia discourse in some of these quote unquote Muslim regimes, So, I mean, I think there's a very cynical kind of use of the term decolonial to talk about folks who are doing some nefarious stuff around the world in Muslim majority countries, And so this is why, again, I think we treat the term with Islamophobia with some hesitancy, with some caution, because it can be very sloppily applied, and create a narrative of Muslim victimhood that frankly wouldn't make sense in the Malaysian or Turkish context in the ways that it is being deployed.
Right, exactly right. I mean, this is it sometimes becomes laughable, and I mean, very well-intentioned folks in these societies that that obviously, I mean, have want a certain interpretation of Islam that they believe has always existed within their societies, that has been tolerant, pluralistic, and so on and so forth. So it's sometimes very well-intentioned individuals. I'm thinking particularly my experience in Malaysia, but now colonized by this whole discourse emanating from Washington and London and so on, that look, this is actually the way that you have to do it, the precise way of countering violent extremism. And there's these things, as soon as someone kind of starts, maybe growing a beard, or this becomes more religious, etc. So it's all of these things that are adopted from the playbook of kind of maybe the New York City Police Department and so on. Which is very disturbing. But I thought I'd bring that up. But one thing, Nazia, I did want to ask you about is also, I love the way you also speak about how Islamophobia is interesting, but Islamophilia may be even more interesting in this sense. And this is going back to kind of the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy, and by someone I think we both admire, that Mahmoud Mamdani's book by that name. But if you can speak a little bit about that, what do you mean by Islamophilia?
Yeah, so Islamophilia is a term that I use to sort of talk about the quest for Muslim, and I'm talking about Muslim Americans in my work, Muslim American legitimacy. So in other words, I remember after September 11th, all of these media pieces that tried really hard to paint Muslims as just like us. And by just like us, they meant they went to business school too, or they went to law school. In other words, they were eager participants in capitalism, and they were pretty silent on political critique. They were pretty silent on sort of the workings of the war on terror. So the good Muslim can exist in many forms, right? And I'm reminded of in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running for president, and the Democratic National Convention, which had out of many times, had squashed the political ambitions of Bernie Sanders and had handed the nomination to Hillary Clinton, put Khizr Khan on stage. And his son's death in a violent, aggressive U.S. illegal war in Iraq was used as proof that Muslim Americans fight in American wars too. And this has been done across the board historically in the U.S., that groups who are experiencing marginalization, it's suggested that they ought to be included because they participate in imperialist wars, right? And that ignores so much. It simplifies so much about what American war making and American militarism is. I mean, look, I teach about the war on terror. I teach about U.S. militarism. And in the U.S., you see a lot of apathy and ignorance about American wars. And part of that is because what the U.S. has is what we call a poverty draft. In other words, the only people who would be on the front lines of American wars are people who have material needs. They need health insurance. They want a college education. They can't afford these things. It's poor folks, even undocumented immigrants, who fight in U.S. wars. I mean, the U.S. has rule over entire colonies. I mean, if we're talking about American Samoa or Puerto Rico, we're talking about territories that offer the U.S. people who can fight and die in U.S. wars, but can't vote for the U.S. president who declares those wars. So, I mean, what does it mean then for a Muslim man to say, my son died in the war in Iraq, therefore even Muslims are American? To use participation in U.S. war making as a justification for including Muslims is a very perverse line of reasoning that the U.S. seems to repeat time and time again.
Exactly, and as if, and in a perverse way, it almost points to the fact that, okay, well, at least you've got it right. I mean, your conception of America is pretty much, yes, militarism, imperialism, and this is the way you become a good American, is actually.
And when we speak about militarism, we're talking about something much vaster than official wars. I mean, militarism is the whole apparatus of war making. And I'll give you an example. The Department of Defense, the US Pentagon, has a special bureau that's in charge of Hollywood. So reviewing movie scripts and also offering funding to cash-strapped directors if they take the Pentagon's advice on these movies. And it isn't just movies. The Department of Defense is also reviewing episodes of Jeopardy, episodes of The Price is Right. These are game shows. The Cupcake Wars, a cooking show. The CIA is similarly involved. So militarism exists in all kinds of spaces in the US, especially, for instance, in American sporting events. You can watch an NFL game, a football game, and the Air Force will do a show before where they show off their new equipment flying over the stadium, and military folks in uniform, marching across the football field and doing a salute. And the US wants to talk about, like North Korea is so militaristic, but the US is so militaristic in ways that Americans don't even register because it's so second nature. It's sort of baked into our surroundings.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that because here in Pakistan and many other countries, we feel like we have, a deep state, a military establishment that is just so is so worshipped. It has to be respected. I mean, I often tell people like if you've grown up in the U.S., and my area was particularly militarized. You had bases all over. That's one thing you really can't touch. I mean, talking about criticizing the U.S. military, it's like you can't touch that. And I'm so glad you spoke about it. How it kind of permeates all levels of kind of American society, and of course, it's imperialist adventures abroad. The final thing, Nazia. So once maybe I can do the show and make it on time. The final thing I did want to ask you for our viewers then, the question, which in some ways we've alluded to parts of the answer to this, the function of this term that we kind of have problems with, but the functional role of Islamophobia then in this throughout the war on terror to the present. How do you place it? How do you position it? Why has it been utilized and employed by the American establishment for what it's been doing? I mean now and even maybe pre 9/11. So
I mean, I think, I recently heard journalist Ben Norton say, it's not that Democrats are a lesser evil, it's that they're a more effective evil. And I think what he meant and what I would add to that is that US imperialism has a lot of trouble with its own bigotry. So in presenting itself as inclusive, as diverse, as tolerant, it can it can get away with a little bit more. And that's why you would see celebrations of Kamala Harris as vice president, who, by the way, in political organizing has earned the nickname Cop Mala because she has been instrumental in expanding the violent and racist system of policing and imprisonment in the US. But that's why people celebrate, what Tariq Ali would call the Obama syndrome. And I think that, a diverse empire solves some of the problems that a bigoted sort of Trump or Bush era US empire would run into. Which, oh, you're going to ban Muslims? Well, okay, well, maybe Biden can repeal the Muslim ban, but still carry out heinous Islamophobic acts with, Muslim American addressing the White House, which just happened for the first time a couple of days ago, things like that. And so diversity is used as a legitimizing rationale.
It is so shocking. I really thought this back in the day a good solid Kashmiri activist. Anyways, go on.
Yeah. So I think diversity is used as a legitimizing rationale for U.S. empire, and that is where this very cynical use of the term Islamophobia arises in the U.S.
Right, and in some ways, what I take from what you're saying is that now, the Biden administration after these years, and perhaps Obama, although he himself had to be very careful because he did not want to be linked too closely with a Muslim heritage that, of course, he was being bashed about for his entire period. But what I take is that in some ways, at this point, the emphasis will be about how we're trying to combat Islamophobia, and in fact, it is about promoting the Islamophilia as part of our diverse American establishment to effectively carry on the same empire building that we've been doing all along, but just doing it in a more friendlier, diverse way. I mean, is
absolutely. That's why people were so panicked about Trump putting kids in cages. But when Biden started putting kids in cages, they called them overflow facilities because cages would not reflect so well on the current administration. So exactly, there's a lot of pageantry, there's a lot of cosmetic changes to empire, but it remains empire.
And of course, he's now become very presidential. I mean, he's replaced Trump. That's that makes him presidential enough, but of course even more so to the next degree because he's now just launched airstrikes in Syria. So that takes him to the next level of being president.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. People are going to celebrate this very presidential act of launching airstrikes on Syria.
Nazia, I really want to thank you for your time on the show. I'm so glad we got you on here in this short amount of time. And I know that Chai will say this to me later on as well. This was an incredibly, incredibly insightful discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Nazia, for being on.